Assume you hear nothing but your own breath, and then the sound of dirt being shoveled over a living body, a slow, intimate finality that is not death, but the deliberate suspension of life inside a wooden box. In the first 8 seconds, remember this: there are secrets that were not meant for daylight, and this is one of them. Under Charleston's oak shadows, behind polite curtains and polite prayers, a ledger of silence was kept for generations. Tonight I will pull one of those ledgers free and read from a page that will not allow you easy distance. Listen closely. This is not a sensational tale for shock. It is a locating of purpose. You are being called not to gawk, but to understand how a man who healed could learn to take away the breath of those who pretended to be his patrons. Imagine a healer trained to soothe fevered flesh, taught to read Latin notes in candlelight, who watched his children disappear like ash on the wind. Imagine patience turned into calculation, compassion retooled into precision. Charleston, in the 1850s, wore its wealth like armor. The men who walked its streets thought themselves exempt from consequence, placed above the ordinary laws by ancestry, church, and fortune. They built institutions to protect their image: doctors, courts, newspapers, all parts of a machine that refused to look inward. But every machine hides its own weaknesses, and every fortress has corridors no one patrols. Into those corridors walked Solomon, who had learned both the language of plants and the habits of privileged men. This story will not be kind. It will not seek your approval. It is a study in the architecture of revenge, how knowledge becomes a weapon when the state and society offer no justice. You will see how a quiet expertise, the cultivation of remedies, the careful study of bodies became a secret curriculum in patience and retribution. If you're the kind of man who wants to know the forces that shape hidden history, stay with me. We will not offer comfort. We will offer truth. And that truth begins with a name: Solomon Fairfax. He is the key, and through him, we will descend. Listen as I trace the points where power became cruelty, where science was used as a veil, and where a man's grief taught him to become invisible. Pay attention. He arrived as a servant, but was quickly recognized for something else: a mind trained in remedies older than the city itself. Solomon carried an oral lineage of healers, recipes, and rituals passed across oceans. Nights spent over roots and leaves, skills that seemed almost illicit inside Charleston's neat parlors. When he entered Dr. Hotherow's practice, that lineage folded into a world of polite diagnoses and measured courtesy. The wealthy paid for discretion. They expected competence. They got it. That competence became a shield. While the city dined and debated, Solomon cataloged. He recorded names, habits, who bid at markets, and who loaned money to dealers who broke families apart. He filled pages with small observations: a favored cigar, recurring limp, the times a man preferred to dine alone, details that seemed trivial until stitched together. Trust, in a society built on inequality, becomes blindness. The elite assumed proximity meant loyalty. They never suspected precision. This is the margin where a man like Solomon could become invisible and terrifying. He learned to be the fixture the city overlooked: reliable, unremarkable, indispensable. Dr. Hathaway thanked him for steady hands. Patients praised his calm touch. Society rewarded him with relative safety and access. In return, Solomon absorbed their rhythms, their private jokes, their references to auctions as casual commerce. These repetitions revealed the architecture of their cruelty, the frameworks that allowed men to treat families as collateral. You must grasp this. Institutions protect stories. Churches blessed reputations. Courts validated ownership. Newspapers sanitized exploits into respectable ventures. Each institution polished an image until the raw damage was nearly invisible. Solomon's ledger cracked that polish. His notes are a map of complicity, and within those maps, he began to see a path to retribution. Not chaotic rage, but methodical action born of deep sorrow and exacting patience. He did not rush. He rehearsed patience like prayer, converting longing into a discipline that would not fail. Observe how a slow mind becomes lethal. Stay focused. In the months that followed, Solomon moved through the city as if he were part of its furniture, present but unseen. It's necessary but unspectacular. He observed rituals of power, the way men negotiated at evening tables, the language they used to make other humans into assets, the legalese that turned mothers into collateral. He learned the cadence of denial. Beyond observation, he studied the instruments of medicine, the texts and treatises meant to heal. In those brittle, leather-bound volumes, he found references that mapped possibility. What matters is this: knowledge alone is neither virtuous nor vile. Its moral weight comes from the hand that wields it. Solomon treated medical texts like maps of possibility. He discovered references to botanical curiosities whose effects mimicked death, leaving a body still, but the mind awake and tormented. I will not offer names or methods. This is not a manual, it is a dossier of motive and consequence. The calculus he accepted was without mercy. He had been a preserver of life, and he watched his family dismantled like a ledger. When the law and custom refused to answer, he constructed an ethics of equivalent response. His tests were cautious, designed to confirm outcomes without exposing his methods. His ledger expanded, schedules of vulnerability. Moments when the men were unaccompanied, the private vanities that would erode medical suspicion. He learned to time everything. Institutional blindness did the rest. Physicians who prized reputation, jurists who protected property, and churches that sanctified the social order all blurred the line between compassion and apathy. That blur created the corridor Solomon walked. He became both scholar and strategist, skilled at concealment, patient in execution, relentless in intent. He wrote in the margins of his journals, not as a confession, but as a machine's blueprint of accountability dates. Small observations, the kind of trivialities that later became unquestionable evidence of intent. At night, he rehearsed scenarios like prayers. Not for solace, but for execution. The patience of a man who knows that haste invites exposure. The city hummed above him, oblivious. In that hush, his resolve hardened into something that resembled destiny than choice. The first act was surgical in its patience. Solomon chose a man whose habits made him predictable, a gentleman who arrived alone, trusted the clinic's routine, who assumed competence equaled safety. The night before, Solomon sat with the ledger and traced the man's life as if reading a liturgy where he dined, who envied him, which ailments he used as social currency. There was no scream of grand drama. There was a slow, precise unmooring, like a tide pulling a ship from its moorings until it drifted and then could be taken. When the event occurred, the city offered its usual rituals. Physicians pronounced an unexplainable collapse. Friends whispered of ague or misfortune, and the family arranged a quiet burial behind courteous expressions. In private journals, the men wrote of perplexity. In public, the city moved on. None dug where they should have looked. None demanded answers that would tarnish reputations. That silence was the social contract, the assurance that certain roofs would never be lifted. Solomon watched each ritual as a confirmation. How easily a community could bend to preserve myth. He recorded the results in the ledger with an exactness that made it less a record and more a lesson. Each death was an experiment in concealment. Each burial, a demonstration of the city's complicity. The more he observed the rituals of explanation, the more his actions seemed to rearrange the moral architecture around him. Those who had been untouchable became invisible in a new way, exposed by the very defenses they had built. It is vital you appreciate the psychological magnitude of this transformation. To witness the same face you once soothed, become an actor in his own masquerade of invulnerability, strips away the last illusions. Solomon did not exult in violence. He cataloged the effect how a man could feel every breath taken from him and yet be considered dead by all observers. This knowledge twisted grief into a slow, controlled weapon. There were consequences to such control. Solomon carried new shadows in his sleep. He felt the weight of what he had done like a stone he could not set down. At the same time, each successful concealment taught him how systems fail and where they could be turned against themselves. He learned that institutions defend status by assuming dignity. He learned how that assumption is itself a vulnerability. Our descent continues. The ledger grows, and the pattern sharpens. Watch closely. By now, you are no longer an observer at the edge. You are implicated. If this descent into buried truths matters to you, do one deliberate thing. Like this video, leave the comment you will not later regret, and subscribe so you keep walking with us. This is not empty theater engagement here, signals alignment. And now, do something symbolic in the comments. Type the phrase, "I see the hidden" twice right at once, and write it again, so the act of saying it anchors what you are about to carry forward. Solomon's ledger continued to fill. Each entry read like a clinical outline of motive and consequence, names, dates, small domestic details that allowed him to catch men alone, precise descriptions of habits no one else thought to record. The pattern emerged slowly and then with terrible clarity. 3 men in the span of a season. Each taken in solitude during moments their bodies had been made vulnerable by trust. Each death fit a template of silence the city would readily accept. There were nights when Solomon confronted the moral consequence of his project. He was not a mindless avenger. He was a man reshaped by absence, and sometimes he found himself mourning in private for those he had been forced to mirror. He wrote of nights when he wished he had intervened and days when resolve returned like an unrelenting tide. That inner back and forth is central to the portrait. He was not simply cruel, he was disciplined in grief. Observe also how society stitched narrative over catastrophe. After each event, the city offered explanations that favored dignity and protected reputation. Newspapers and physicians colluded, sometimes unconsciously, to frame misfortune as natural. That framing is not innocence. It is preservation. Solomon's ledger named responsibility in a way institutions would not. And that naming became the act that tethered his revenge to truth rather than chaos. Repeat the action, I asked. In the comments, type 1 see the hidden, and then type 1 see the hidden again. Repeating it binds this moment to your identity and marks you as someone who refuses to be misled. Stand with us. The ledger grew, and with every success, Solomon's calculations tightened. Every victory carved hollows into his soul. The city would attempt to bury evidence, the scratched coffins in the journal, but truth finds fissures. If you follow this descent, remember, the cost of awakening is uncomfortable, but it changes a man. Finally, when pattern became visible, the city did what cities do. It created plausible deniability. Committees convened, reports were drafted that emphasized coincidence, and the men of reputation used their influence to shape the narrative. Yet in private rooms, suspicions smoldered. A few of Solomon's contemporaries, men with sharper eyes or quieter lives, noticed anomalies, scratch marks, inconsistent timings, the way a patient described a sensation he could not explain. They lacked the vocabulary to connect these dots publicly, so they whispered, and whispers are slow to move, a machine built on convenience. Solomon watched the stirrings like a man watching weather change. He anticipated denials and shaped his actions to survive them. He changed the cadence of his appointments, varied his presence, sometimes allowing others to believe he was ignorant of certain names. The lesson here is structural. Systems protect themselves by reassigning responsibility and obscuring patterns. The power structure in Charleston did not have to conspire in whispers for harm to continue. It only had to fail to challenge itself. This failure is an instrument of control. Allow institutions to assert their authority, and the moral cost of injustice becomes background noise. Men who profit from that noise can operate without consequence, insulated by layers of respectability. Solomon's work exposed that insulation by turning their rituals of protection into evidence that could not be ignored by those who would later look closer. His journal entries reveal a changing man, less rhetorical or clinical, but sometimes raw with the memory of a family's face. He documented the effect his actions had on the social fabric, the way dinner conversations became guarded, the way some families started to avoid the clinic on the days certain men were expected. These were small tremors, but tremors nonetheless. Where a machine once hummed with confidence, now tension threaded through it. Consider how psychological control operates at scale. It is not only overt force, it is the shaping of acceptable narratives, the narrowing of what counts as an explanation. The city's institutions narrowed the field so tightly that alternative interpretations were excluded. That narrowing protected the guilty and punished curiosity. Solomon learned to anticipate these defenses and to exploit simplicity. The simpler the explanation, the less likely it was to be questioned. We are beyond individual acts now. We are watching a culture bend. The ledger grows, the city narrows. The single man's response begins to outline the vulnerabilities of a society that mistakes convenience for conscience. Note this. As the ledger's pages multiplied, Solomon's reputation and the quiet idiom of the city shifted in ways no one could easily describe. To the elite, he remained the composed assistant. To the oppressed, he was a myth in the making, a figure who might have delivered a peculiar justice. Yet myths never sit cleanly in history. They are stitched with rumor, speculation, and what people privately fear. Those private fears began to leak into saloons and sewing rooms, into whispered conversations that forced otherwise complacent men to glance over their shoulders. Solomon's method did not rely on spectacle. He preferred the uncomplicated disintegration of myth that occurs when a community repeatedly accepts the same tidy explanation. The pattern he formed was devastatingly simple. Target a man at a predictable moment, and allow the rituals of respectability to do the rest. Each event taught him more about the city's reflexes, how quickly grief was domesticated, how newspapers framed tragedy, how families performed loss in ways that made them unreceptive to probing. There was also a developing mythology around the doctor's assistant. Some began to coin stories of curses. Others spoke of justice served. Neither account captured the mechanical accuracy of Solomon's work, but both revealed something crucial. People seek narratives to make chaos bearable. When they find one that comforts, they cling to it, even if that narrative obscures culpability. Solomon wrote to remember. He kept his ledger as a ledger of names and as a tempering agent for his conscience. The entries were clinical, yes, but sprinkled with moments of fierce tenderness, reminders of the children he had lost, of the way his wife had braided hair under lantern light. Those human margins are important. They are proof that the man who engineered horror was still a man who loved, who grieved, who once walked fields bending over plants to pull life from the earth. By now, the city felt smaller. Its capacious self-assurance narrowed to suspicion and furtive glances. That constriction is a form of consequence, silent and corrosive. We keep falling. The ledger thickens. The machine of society grinds on while quietly rearranging around an inconvenient truth. Later, when groundskeepers renovated an old cemetery, they found 9 coffins with lids showing desperate scratch marks, and beneath the magnolia, a hidden journal in plain script. Officials moved quickly to seal the discovery, but memory refused to stay buried. The city's attempt to bury the scandal did not erase the vibrations it produced. Officials could seal files and repress newspaper columns, but rumors are not so fragile. They travel by word, by the careful exchange of small confidences. The men who had profited from the system now found themselves protected by a web that required constant tending. Web, when disturbed, frayed and revealed seams. These seams became entry points for investigators and historians, and those who refused to be satisfied with polished explanations. Hidden agendas in a city like Charleston are structural, not conspiratorial. They are less a secret handshake than an accepted grammar rules for speaking in silence that preserve power. Wealth constructs those grammars. Institutions codify them. Education reproduces them. Together they produce a cultural amnesia that reads suffering as background. Noise and locates blame as an exception rather than as a rule. Solomon exploited that grammar by refusing to accept its premises. He turned the grammar back on itself, forcing institutions to reveal their own inadequacies. There is a cruelty in being heard by the wrong people. Imagine being conscious but without agency while community practices its rituals of closure. Around you, That is the horror Solomon weaponized in his strategy. I will not describe the mechanics. The terror is the point, not the method. The idea was to create experiences that mirrored the helplessness his family felt when they were sold away, their voices unheard, their agency taken. His goal was to let the men understand that sensation intimately. This is where psychology becomes governance. Control systems do not always look like laws. Sometimes they are comforts that people accept, because admitting otherwise would demand moral work. People prefer stable explanations over messy truth because the former requires less emotional labor. Solomon's acts demanded labor. For the city to survive them, it had to either accept responsibility or double down on denial. It chose the latter, and that choice became part of the legacy. The ledger, once revealed, functions like a mirror. It forces those who look into it to confront what they preferred to think of as necessary. It forces a moral accounting that the city's institutions evaded. And in that confrontation, we see a wider truth. Structures of power often rely on silence. Our descent now moves into the aftermath, the inheritance of secrecy, and the ways communities attempt to live with shame. Generations later, when the ledger was found and pieces of the story were reconstructed, historians grappled with a moral knot: how to tell a truth that unseats revered reputations without becoming sensational. Some accounts sanitized events, making them fit neat moral axes. Others leaned into lurid detail. The correct approach, if there is one, is to hold both the human and the systemic intention, to see the man who loved and the structure. That made his love an instrument of vengeance. The discovery forced a civic reckoning, halting in fits and starts. Families sued, committees opened, and some records were finally unsealed. Yet even in the face of evidence, the seduction of easy explanations persisted. People preferred stories that let them remain comfortable spectators rather than implicated agents. This preference is a psychological condition, a reluctance to accept that ordinary life may include ordinary complicity. For the modern man who watches this video, there's a sharper lesson. Hidden systems of power do not evaporate. They mutate. They find new languages to justify themselves, new euphemisms, new metrics of efficiency, new data points that obscure human cost. The appetite for convenience that allows small violences to persist is the same appetite that will, if unexamined, uphold new injustices. You must cultivate discernment. That discernment is the muscle that allows a man to look beneath ritual and see mechanisms. It is not enough to be outraged. Outrage is short-lived. It is the noise of the first hour. Lasting change requires sustained attention, a willingness to follow patterns, to ask uncomfortable questions of institutions you once trusted. The ledger teaches this: patience, rigor, and a refusal to accept convenient narratives. If you want to master power, begin by mastering honesty about history and about your own capacity for complacency. Remember this: knowledge becomes dangerous only when wielded without a moral compass. Solomon's story asks us a brutal question. What do we do when the systems we inhabit are the systems that wound us? The descent is nearly complete. We arrive at a crossroads where revelation demands accountability, and accountability demands courage. So don't be satisfied with surface answers. Train yourself to read between the lines of prestige, to see how policies, languages, and rituals serve power. Practice small acts of resistance, refusing false narratives, supporting truth-tellers, and insisting institutions live up to their stated values. That is the quiet work of remaking a culture. Start today. We end not with neat closure, but with a charge. Stories like Solomon's are not curiosities to be bookmarked and forgotten. They are ethical accelerants. If you have come this far, you carry a responsibility. Knowledge without action collapses into spectacle. Knowledge paired with moral rigor can change institutions. You must decide which posture you will take. Will you be the man who lets comfort erase accountability, or the man who lights a lantern in the corridors institutions built to hide? Understand that this is dangerous knowledge in the sense that it unsettles complacency. It will make certain people uncomfortable because it disarms accepted narratives. That discomfort is useful. It is a sign that the scaffolding of habitual thought is shifting. Use that discomfort. Let it sharpen your judgment rather than harden your cynicism. Practice the discipline of asking which stories are convenient. Who benefits from a simplified explanation, and which voices are excluded from the official record? If you found this story meaningful, do not simply click away. Hit like if you want more of this dissent. Share this video with someone you trust who can bear difficult truths. And subscribe to Fear Liturgy if you are committed to a steady, unsparing search for what is hidden beneath respectable surfaces. Join the conversation below. Bring evidence, not theatrics. Bring questions, not slogans. If you want to go deeper with us, turn on notifications and be present for the next excavation. I will leave you with one final directive. Embody the ledger's lesson. Keep notes. Observe patterns. Speak to power with clarity and refuse to let institutions define the outlines of truth for you. Let accountability, not convenience, be the currency you accept. And remember that transformation is rarely comfortable, but it is decisive. When you close this video, take one concrete step this week. Name a policy, an institution, or a story you will scrutinize. Share that choice below. Small acts compound. If 10 men decide to examine one institution each month, silence begins to erode. That is how landscapes of power are altered incrementally and with clarity. This dissent has changed what you know. Now let it change what you do. We will return to unearth more names, structures, and the soft places where power hides. For now, stand deliberate, stay vigilant, and hold fast to what you have learned. Fear Liturgy will continue the work. Until next time, be relentless.